Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Gary Olson, president of Daemen College, and I'm pleased to welcome all of you to this, our third lecture in the Daemen College Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series. You know, we're deeply honored today to have as our third distinguished lecturer a national leader of extraordinary stature, the Honorable Debbie Wasserman Schultz, representing the 23rd District of the state of Florida. Congressman Brian Higgins, our first distinguished lecturer and Daemen's representative in Congress, will give a formal introduction of the Congresswoman in a few minutes. I first would like to thank Dr. Lynn Worsham for first suggesting that we invite today's speaker. Dr. Worsham has been a lifelong advocate for women's issues, as is our Congresswoman, and she turned to me at one point and said, we need to bring her to this campus. And so thanks to her and Congressman Higgins, there she is. So now it's my honor to turn to our esteemed friend and Congressman and Daemen College Community Advisory Board member, Brian Higgins.
Thank you, everybody, for being here. It's truly a great honor to introduce Debbie Wasserman Schultz. Debbie is a classmate of mine. She is a friend and a colleague, but you should also know that she is a rising star in national Democratic politics. She serves as chair of the National Democratic Committee at a time when our nation faces great challenges. She's also an author of a new book, for the next generation, a wake-up call to solving our nation's problems. And I'm sure you'll hear some insight, which is outlined in her book, as to how to grow the American economy, how to grow opportunity. And we here in Buffalo and Western New York will be very receptive to that message. So without further ado, I present to you my friend, my colleague, and the National Democratic Chair, Debbie Wasserman Schultz.
Thank you very much. I am always shorter than the height of the microphone and sometimes the podium. So, Brian, thank you very much. I truly appreciate your friendship, your leadership, and you know, we had compared to recent years, a relatively small class. I think only 15 new Democratic members were elected in 2004 in our class. And so it gave us an opportunity. You know, you do all those freshman things, which obviously, clearly at a college, you understand better than most what I mean. But, you know, we did the freshman circuit together, the orientations and the meetings, and our families got to know each other. And you really get to know what makes someone tick and why they have chosen the leadership path and the path of public service that they have. And Brian has made such a long time, really lifelong commitment to public service when, you know, there are so many other opportunities for someone as brilliant and committed as he is. The fact that he chose public service is really a testament to his commitment to making the world better and to his commitment to this region of the state. So he's also fortunate that he picked up this part of New York in redistricting, and I know he appreciates that. Brian's lived in Western New York his whole life, from his childhood to his college years to his distinguished careers at the city, state, and now the federal level. And I know how much that matters up here. I'm a Long Island girl. I was born in Queens, raised on Long Island, and you know a little bit about how New Yorkers think. You can take the girl out of New York, as they say. You can never really take the New York out of the girl, and I am no exception. I can tell you, well, I'll tell you that in a moment. I also want to thank President Olson for inviting me here today. I really am honored to be the third speaker in this Distinguished Leaders Lecture Series, following Congressman Higgins and our colleague Eric Cantor. And I'm sure you're very proud to be at the helm of a leading institution here in New York, and I'm honored to be here with you. So, as I mentioned, I am a native New Yorker and was born in Queens, in Forest Hills, and raised in both Nassau and Suffolk County. And really, whether it's from Buffalo to Brooklyn or Albany to the Adirondacks, New York has it all. I'm a very proud native New Yorker. I have incredibly fond memories of my childhood growing up here, other than the cold weather. which is why I'm now a Floridian. I followed the same pathway much earlier than many of my retired New York constituents. And the reason that I was so excited to be able to accept this invitation is because of how important it is that you get to know me. And let me share with you why. Because you have one of the finest representatives in the United States Congress in Brian Higgins. But, really, and I don't say that lightly. You would imagine that we serve with varying degrees of quality when it comes to representation. So you are very fortunate that you drew the long straw when it came and chose well. But the reason that it's important to get to know me is because I'm going to be your representative when you retire and move to my district in 20 years. So important that I give you a little preview before you come on down to South Florida. But really what it is that my interest in seeing the wider world took me down to Florida, to the University of Florida. Now I bleed orange and blue, as I did for my whole life because my father is a Gator alum as well. And I got my bachelor's and master's there in political science. And it was really at the University of Florida that I discovered my passion for public service. I'm Jewish, and around my family dinner table, my parents really always instilled in me the importance of Tikkun Olam, repairing the world, and that was part of our responsibility as Jews to make sure that we could at least devote part of our lives to making the world a better place and giving back to our community, especially because we were fortunate. Before I took that pathway, though, and I don't think Brian knows this story, I wanted to be a veterinarian. I've always been a very focused person and did whatever I set my mind to, completely 100%, 150%. I'm a nothing halfway person. And I went to the University of Florida, planned to become a veterinarian, and then chemistry and I didn't get along very well. So when I was president of the Student Senate and debating fellow students about how we could best serve the university and the direction that the university should go, I realized that public service was my calling. It was like I got hit by a lightning bolt. I suddenly realized that the Tikkun Olam that ran through my blood, through my veins, was something that I could make a career. And I, always only half-jokingly say that I took that value to heart, and now Tikkun Olam was a career choice. So during graduate school, I got a job as a legislative assistant to a South Florida legislator. I moved to South Florida. I met my husband and got married and started my post-educational adult life. As luck would have it, I was married for a grand total of 1 year. We had just bought our first house when, for me, the professional chance of a lifetime came along. My mentor and then boss, Peter Deutsch, who was a state legislator at the time, knew of my desire to run for office someday. And he encouraged me to run right that year in 1992 for the state house seat that he was vacating. He was planning to run for Congress. I was actually going to manage his congressional campaign. He said, "Debbie, no time like the present. You should seize this opportunity. It's an open seat. You can run and you'd win. You should run now." So when I got over the shot, I was 25. Well, yeah, 3 years out of graduate school. When I got over the initial shock, I was excited, but I was really hesitant. I thought that my pathway would take me to that goal eventually, but I thought I would take the pathway that most women take, which is after having gotten married and having children, when the kids would be my future kids would be a little older and more independent, then I would be able to pursue my dream to run. Didn't think I would have the opportunity before we even conceived that we would have children. So it was 1992, which turned out to be the year of the woman. We were in a recession, and the gap then was widening between the rich and the less fortunate. And I thought about what inspired me to work in public service in the first place, when deciding whether to make this leap and seize the opportunity. And public service, what led me to public service was my desire to help people, particularly young families, to improve education for our kids, to make sure everybody had access to quality, affordable health care. Sound familiar? But most of all, I looked at the other legislators in Florida who were almost all older white men, And I felt that my voice, the voice of people who looked like me, wasn't represented. There was no woman that was as young as I was that was ever elected to the state legislature. And my boss, Representative Peter Deutsch, said that I should think about, in helping me get through my hesitancy, suggested that I think about whether or not I thought anyone currently serving were doing a better job than I thought I could. And that's when I knew I had to run. So I sat down with my husband, Steve, who I've been married to now for 23 years, and he works as a community banker, not political at all. No one ever in our family had been involved in politics before or since. And we talked about what it would mean for us as a newly married couple, but also what this meant for our future family and our future in general. So with virtually no name recognition, a crowd of people, as you would imagine, the good old boys told me not to run. They told me to get online, to wait my turn. I said, all right, thanks for the advice. I hope you support me when I win the primary. I'm going to roll the dice and run anyway. So I ran. I walked. I walked and I walked and I walked. I knocked on 25,000 doors myself, because I had 3 volunteers, and they had other things that I needed them to do. So I knocked on 25,000 doors through 95-degree blazing heat in the middle of the summer in Florida, and was ultimately in a 6-way Democratic primary and got 53% of the vote in a 6-way race. So that was pretty neat. And I was the youngest woman ever elected to the legislature in Florida history, and I still have the beat-up shoes that I wore all through that summer to remind me of where I started and to literally keep me grounded. And I took the stories of the constituents whose doorsteps that I stood on with me to represent them in the Florida legislature. I passed legislation, and here's where it matters, who represents you. That's why making sure that we have diversity and representation is so critical, because I'd like to think that some of the bills that I introduced that eventually became law, because of the lens through which I looked as a 26-year-old woman, would simply not have gotten introduced. They just wouldn't have risen to the top of the legislative agenda without someone like me pushing them. And it didn't have to be me, as long as there was someone like me doing it. So I passed legislation called the Gender Minority Balance Bill, because we noticed that 1,200 regulatory and statutory boards in Florida had virtually or hardly any representation from women. And so often those boards and commissions are really a pipeline to leadership. How often have you heard of candidates who've never served in public office, but their resume includes service on a lot of these appointed boards where they cut their teeth in terms of policy and leadership and the political process, and if they're all populated with white men, then that good old boy system just continues to be perpetuated. Women needed a little bit of a boost. Not so much affirmative action, but making sure that that leaders who appointed the representatives to those boards had to look a little harder and spend a little more time focusing on diversity. So that bill became law, not until the first version of it was vetoed by, unfortunately, Governor Lawton Chiles, who was a Democrat, and who I worked for in college. That was a little bit of a bummer, but after he vetoed it, we went back and negotiated on what language he'd be comfortable with, and that has been the law for the last 22 years in Florida, and we have far more women and minorities on those boards and commissions, and more women all across government now. I also introduced and passed the drive-through baby bill and the drive-through mastectomy bill. I'll get to the drive-through mastectomy bill in a moment. Never did I think that I would actually need it as a law. But the Drive-Through Baby Act, if you remember, at the end of the 90s, insurance companies were getting a lot of negative attention because they were forcing women out of the hospital within 24 hours after giving birth. No opportunity to recover, no discussion between the doctor and the woman. Now, I hadn't. That was right around when I gave birth to my first 2 kids. I have twin, almost 15-year-olds. Their birthday's Thursday, and so I had not yet had kids when I passed this law. But clearly knew that after 24 hours, you were maybe not quite ready to leave the hospital, even if you didn't have a C-section. And that decision perhaps should not be dictated by whether the insurance company is going to cover the bill. It should be dictated by whether the doctor and the patient think they're ready to leave the hospital. So that amazing that we had to pass a law to ensure some common sense when it came to healthcare coverage. So fast forward 12 years later to 2004, 2 dogs, a cat, 2 children, another baby on the way, and another call from now Congressman Peter Deutsch, who let me know he was going to run for the United States Senate and I should get ready to run for Congress. And it really has been a distinct honor to represent my constituents in South Florida over the last decade in our nation's capital. I've been able to put the values that my parents raised me to believe in, like I said, making the world a better place, giving back to my community, my life's work, which is really an amazing feeling. I mean, to be able to get up every day and spend the whole day thinking and doing the work on the values that that have been instilled in me since I could comprehend anything. And I've had the privilege of working with Brian and our colleagues, of putting pen to paper, authoring and supporting legislation on issues like swimming pool safety to deal with drowning prevention, which as we come into the summer season, we all need to make sure we're extra vigilant about, because the drowning rate of children younger than 5 is far too high. Tax return identity theft, people who file their tax return electronically, and then we have this huge rash of identity theft where thieves are filing people's tax returns for them, collecting their refund, and the taxpayer doesn't find out until they go to file their tax return, and the IRS tells them, oh, you've already filed it, and we've sent out your refund. That's not a significant enough penalty as far as the crime that's committed. And things like ensuring rights for cancer patients and victims of sexual crimes. So that's a bit about my background of how I got here and my career, and I want to take a moment to talk with you about the collision of my personal and my professional life that forever changed me really as a woman, but also as a policymaker. So shortly after my 41st birthday, I found a lump in my breast. It was very soon after my first mammogram, and fortunately I knew what was normal for me, so I knew when something felt different, and I found myself facing those words that no one ever wants to hear. You have cancer. So 7 major surgeries, and 6 years later, I'm standing here before you cancer-free, which is wonderful. But thank you. But that experience changed my life and my policy priorities forever. And I knew that as soon as I was cancer-free, I went through the experience very privately. My children were 4 and 9 when I was diagnosed, and cancer is a really scary thing. And professionally, I really wanted, when you have cancer, and I imagine there's probably at least a handful of cancer survivors in the room, given the statistics, but when you have cancer, you really feel like you've lost all control. It's very isolating, and you just want to get a handle on controlling the things that you can control in your life. And I knew what would happen. I had very early stage breast cancer, and I was going to be okay, but I had a lot to go through in a year. And I didn't want, and it was the presidential election year, it was 2008, and I didn't want very well-meaning people to decide for me or to decide not to ask me to do something because Debbie's got cancer, So I wanted to control that part of my life and decide for myself how much I was capable of. And I needed normalcy. I couldn't sit out the presidential campaign. I mean, I was a national co-chair for Hillary. It was so important to me. It was the most involved that I had ever been in a presidential campaign. And, I just needed to make sure that life stayed as normal as possible. So as soon as I was cancer-free, I really knew I would devote myself, double down on my devotion to helping others who've faced the same diagnosis that I did and the same challenges that I did as a young woman in dealing with breast cancer. And so that's why I introduced the Breast Health Education and Awareness Requires Learning Young Act, or the EARLY Act, which Brian was a co-sponsor of, which I was so grateful for. And what the EARLY Act did, and when I went public and shared my experience publicly, I wanted to make sure that I filled a niche, that I was able to not just raise my hand and say, me too, I'm for more funding for breast cancer research. Of course, we all are. But I wanted to make sure that my experience and that I could use my profile to help make a difference in something related to breast cancer. So what we found was that young women, who were about 10% of the breast cancer cases, really just constantly got swept aside. healthcare providers dismissed them when they would come into the doctor's office with a problem. They knew something was wrong, but they didn't know what it was, and they were sent away so often. You don't have breast cancer. Young women don't get breast cancer. Come back in 6 months. We'll see how it is. It's probably just a cyst. Well, what happens to young women when they're dismissed that way, rather than thoroughly examined, is that they come back in 6 months, and it's often breast cancer that's diagnosed at a much later stage than it would have been. And so breast cancer, there is not as much breast cancer in young women, but the mortality rates are not declining like the rest of the cancer population, because these women are dismissed. And there are also unique challenges that young women deal with when they are dealing with breast cancer that older women aren't dealing with. If you're a single young woman, girls who are in their 20s and even 30s, and they have breast cancer and they have to have a mastectomy, or they're going through chemo, and a doctor never has a conversation with them about preserving their fertility. So often I talk to young women who never had that conversation. It's critical to have that conversation. Or if you're dating, which date do you share with your date that you've had a double mastectomy, or that you're a breast cancer survivor? I mean, how do you even bring that up? There are needs that someone in their 50s, 60s, and 70s just don't have to deal with. And thankfully, women in general are living many more years as survivors. So we have challenges that have never really been thought about, because more women died when they had breast cancer than do today. And so we need to make sure that we're addressing their needs. So what the Early Act did was it created in the Centers for Disease Control a national education and awareness campaign targeted at young women so that they could focus on what was normal for them, so they knew when something felt different, and also help highlight the breast cancer risks facing young women 45 and younger, and empower them with the tools that they need to fight the disease and live as survivors. And so when the Early Act became law, it became law as part of the Affordable Care Act. For me, it was a life-affirming victory for survivors, a legislative victory for all of us, and for the families and for loved ones who lost their loved ones' lives to the disease. So the Early Act is up for renewal this year, and we're going to focus on survivorship issues when we go through the reauthorization process. But in speaking of cancer and the Affordable Care Act, many of you, I'm sure, know that a principal protection of the ACA is that no one ever has to worry about losing their insurance coverage, because of the 129 million Americans who live in this country, if you have a pre-existing condition, you don't have to worry about being dropped or denied coverage any longer. We have a more secure and prosperous nation, and as a result, we should be providing quality, affordable health care as a right and not a privilege. And toward that end, the numbers are speaking for themselves, with more than 8 million people who signed up for plans through their healthcare exchanges, millions more covered through Medicaid and through their parents' insurance, and with about 85% of people already having paid their premiums as part of Obamacare, we can see that despite some of the bumps along the way, and there were a few during the rollout, we have a new positive era in healthcare that's upon us. Now, unfortunately, you wouldn't know it from looking at House Republicans' legislative agenda. We've voted more than 50 times on legislation to repeal or substantially undercut the Affordable Care Act. They even shut the government down to try to block funding it. And we've got many other pressing issues that are on the back burner. That was part of what, and that's so nice of you to mention my book, but that the book was called For the Next Generation, and it was a wake-up call because we have so many issues that get shoved to the back burner because the Republicans that we're dealing with have this my way or the highway attitude, and they've been strangled by extremism. So we have a need to pass comprehensive immigration reform. In fact, I don't know if you saw this, Brian, but the president of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce yesterday, in a panel, in an interview, said that the Republicans shouldn't even bother to field a candidate in 2016 unless comprehensive immigration reform is passed. That they just shouldn't show up and field a candidate. I mean, if they don't, to not recognize that this is a critical element of making sure that we can keep our economy thriving and strong, then they're really not paying enough attention. And we've got to increase the federal minimum wage. You should not be working full-time and also have to be on government assistance. I mean, that's just, it's a shanda in my faith tradition. That word always seems to fit best. If you're not Jewish, it means like it's a real shame. Inexcusable, really. We've got millions of Americans who still find themselves unemployed, about 100,000, about 100,000 who still are struggling to find work, and we're not extending their unemployment insurance. So Republican intransigence is frustrating because we know it can't be all our way. I know that even as the chair of the DNC. We need to sit down and work together and try to focus on moving our economy forward. And I can't stress enough the difference between policymaking and political theater. And despite what some would have you believe, they're not the same. And I say that knowing that there's a gray area between politics and policy, and it's not always so clear. So as I wrap up, I want to just tell you, we have real challenges before our nation that need serious solutions. And people like Brian and I are honored to represent our constituents who keep us accountable, who stay informed, who voice their concerns, and who demand action to address those concerns. And like I said, we know that digging in and insisting on everything being our way is not going to get us anywhere. We need to work together. We need to comb through our differences so we can move our country forward. And that's how a healthy, vibrant democracy is supposed to function. And the exchange between citizens and their elected officials is so critical for its success. So thank you again for having me here today. Apologize for being late. We were, combing Main Street to find you. And it really is a privilege to join you at Daemen College today and to be here with my colleague, Brian Higgins. Thank you so much. Thank you. You're welcome.
We're going to rush off now. No questions.
I thought we were going to do questions.
Oh, okay. She has a tight schedule, but there is a little bit of time for some questions.
Brian is giving me permission with a head nod that I can take a few questions. Yeah.
What he said there.
Okay, thank you. I think I got the gist of your question. Thank you, sir. Thank you. I'll just generally address the peace process and say it this way. I really completely disagree with your characterization of Israel being a roadblock to the establishment of a Palestinian state. That's simply not true. I know Bergie Herzog, and he doesn't believe that that's the case. He's the leader of the Labor Party right now in Israel. Prime Minister Netanyahu has very much focused on making sure that we can reach an agreement facilitated by the United States, and we should all be incredibly appreciative of Secretary Kerry, who has, put Herculean effort into trying to bring both sides together for direct bilateral discussions. And look, you have the Palestinians who have contributed to the challenges, as well as the Israelis. Both sides are culpable in making it harder for them to actually sit down and stay at the table. The only way that they're going to have two states living side by side in peace, which is absolutely something that we must accomplish, is if they stay at the table and they stop putting preconditions like the Palestinians have insisted on recently and previously on even continuing to talk. There can't be any preconditions. What we need to make sure that the Israelis and the Palestinians do is focus on getting through the thorniest issues. The Palestinians obviously need a commitment that they are going to be able to have a state. The Israelis have committed to that. But Israel cannot be expected to negotiate with a government or a quasi or an organization like Fatah or the PLO when they are under a assault from a terrorist organization that Fatah is now proposing to merge with. Hamas, which is the government in Gaza, is still sworn to Israel's destruction, still is designated as a terrorist organization, still refuses to recognize Israel's legitimate right to exist at all, never mind as a Jewish and democratic state. And I don't know how the Israeli government can be expected to negotiate with them. I won't have time for back and forth, but to negotiate with an organization that supports its eventual destruction. Now, when it comes to the establishment of the Palestinians, Israel, and this has been a long-standing through many, many administrations, Israel needs to stop adding to the so-called settlements, because if you've been to Israel and seen what is often described as a settlement, it's no more a settlement than, the suburbs that I represent in South Florida in many cases. And the disagreement is over, in some Jerusalem neighborhoods, whether or not a family is going to be able to add on to their home when they have a baby and expand the footprint of a residence that's already there. The reality is that there will be mutually agreed upon land swaps in any final status deal, where some parts of Israel will eventually be moved to whatever the boundaries are of a Palestinian state are, and some parts of the Western Bank, of the West Bank, will be a part of Israel. And that's the reality of what a final status negotiation will look like. And the only way we're going to really be able to bring this in for a landing is if both sides come to the table without preconditions. So thank you very much.
Different topic, but not
Please.
a really easy one.
Okay, that's all right.
Both our states, both your states, as we found out today, share the Atlantic coastline.
Yes,
And
for now,
both,
until I represent Orlando.
exactly, Miami and New York are both going to
Yeah.
be severely threatened by global warming. What can we do to get the Congress unstuck and stopping on science?
Well, elect fewer members of the Tea Party. I mean, that's the political answer. I mean, we have too many Republicans. I mean, my U.S. Senator, Marco Rubio, said on national television on Sunday that he plans or thinks he's capable of serving as president, while simultaneously saying that he does not believe that global warming and climate change were man-made, that man has contributed to, and doesn't believe the scientists. I mean, 97% of scientists agree that our problems with our carbon footprint and global warming and increasing temperatures and extreme weather events are the result of global warming and climate change. I'm not a scientist, and I don't have a lot of scientific experience, but if there are any scientists in the room, can you tell me when 97% of scientists agree on anything? If they've had that much consensus, almost unanimity, then they might be right. It's a deep concern. And I write about, I have a whole chapter on energy and the environment and the need for us to deal with this issue. We've had 9 inches of sea level rise in the last 30 years in South Florida. 9 inches. It's so frightening. And I mean, the reality is that in the next 50 years, and already there's unpreventable flooding that is going to make part of my district uninhabitable. I represent the whole southeastern coastline from Hollywood all the way down to the entirety of Miami Beach, and their streets are flooding. That some of it is irreversible, but we do have an opportunity to reduce our carbon footprint. The policy answer is we should be able to sit down with our friends across the aisle and at least agree that some of the impact is the result of human error, human mistakes, human impact. So let's not quibble about which part of it is. Let's just agree that some of it is man-made. Let's establish some policy. And by the way, the carbon tax, the cap and trade legislation, that was originally a Republican idea. It was developed in the 1970s when the Clean Air Act was initially adopted. We've already got energy companies who are changing and national companies that are planning for the fact that they are going to have to pay a carbon tax. They know it's coming. It's mind-boggling. And that's not the only solution. There are plenty of other things we need to do. Investing in renewable energy, using all the above approach, which President Obama and congressional Democrats support, which, by the way, was a Republican priority until Democrats decided we agreed with it, and then suddenly it was the worst idea in the world. So it's just, like I said, in what I said throughout my remarks, if the chair of the National Democratic Party can recognize that everything doesn't have to be our way, then we should be able to have some maturity in the Republican Party and some commitment to our future. And I think I can speak for Brian when I say that I know we wish that we had more Republican colleagues who cared less about hanging on to their power and more about working together to move our country forward. So thank you all so much. It's such a privilege to be here.